On December 9, 2001, in Durham, North Carolina, Kathleen Peterson was found dead at the bottom of the staircase inside the Forest Hills home she shared with Michael Peterson. Her body lay among bloodstains on the steps and nearby surfaces, turning an ordinary passageway into the central evidence scene in a death investigation that would continue for years. The staircase connected the main levels of the house, carrying the routines of daily life between rooms. That night, it became the location of Kathleen's final injuries. Investigators had to determine whether she had fallen there by accident, whether she had been attacked, or whether the blood had been disturbed after the event in a way that changed its meaning. The first conflict formed almost immediately. Michael Peterson gave one explanation. Kathleen had lost her balance, fallen down the stairs, and suffered injuries that proved fatal. Durham authorities treated the death as a homicide, meaning they believed another person had caused Kathleen's injuries. From that point forward, the same staircase was examined as both a possible accident site and a possible crime scene. Blood made the question harder, not simpler. Drops, smears, and larger stains appeared on the walls, steps, and floor around Kathleen's body. Investigators and later experts examined their shapes, distribution, and apparent direction. The fall explanation had to account for those marks, while the homicide theory had to explain how an assault could have produced them. But the staircase offered no clear answer. Bloodstains could show where droplets landed, how they spread, and whether some contact had occurred with the surface. They could not by themselves provide a complete account of Kathleen's final seconds. A stain had no date, no signature, and no label identifying the exact action that created it. The central uncertainty was painfully narrow. Kathleen was dead, and Michael was the only known person present in the house when the emergency call was made. Investigators therefore compared his account with the physical evidence, the injuries documented by medical professionals, and the condition of the staircase. The question was not simply what the blood looked like, but what conclusions it could reliably support. That uncertainty reaches beyond this one home. A staircase is a place people cross without thought, often carrying laundry, reaching for a light, or moving between bedrooms and living spaces. Its steps are designed for routine movement, not for preserving evidence. When an injury occurs there, ordinary features such as height, angle, friction, and nearby walls can become critical to reconstructing what happened. After one terrible night, that ordinary space became impossible to understand. The home remained standing, but its meaning changed for everyone connected to Kathleen. Each step could be interpreted as part of an accidental fall or as part of a violent encounter. The physical setting stayed the same, while the competing explanations made the same surfaces tell entirely different stories. In Durham, the investigation took shape around that conflict. Kathleen's death was considered suspicious because the scene contained significant blood and because the circumstances did not settle investigators' concerns about a simple fall. The number and location of the stains became important, but so did their limits. Blood could raise questions, yet raising a question was not the same as proving an answer. The inquiry moved from the staircase to medical findings, witness accounts, and Michael Peterson's statements. Kathleen's injuries were evaluated alongside the blood evidence, while prosecutors and defense attorneys developed opposing interpretations of the scene. Each new detail was measured against the same unresolved question. Did the evidence support an accidental death? Or did it reveal a homicide committed inside the home? Before the case became a battle over stains, Kathleen had to be remembered as a person. She was a wife, a mother, a sister, and a professional whose death affected relatives and friends far beyond the staircase. The investigation focused on blood and injuries because those were measurable facts, but every measurement concerned the death of someone whose absence permanently altered the lives around her. Every argument about blood, motive, and expert opinion began with that loss. The courtroom would later turn private grief into public evidence, placing photographs, medical findings, and competing reconstructions before a jury. No theory could restore Kathleen's life or remove the uncertainty from her family. The legal process could only decide whether the evidence met the burden required for a criminal conviction. Bloodstain pattern analysis is an attempt to read how blood moved through a space. Investigators study the size, shape, location, and distribution of marks, sometimes considering the angle at which droplets struck a surface. Those observations can help form a reconstruction of movement and force, but they remain interpretations built from incomplete physical traces. Some patterns may suggest that blood fell vertically, was projected through the air, or was transferred by contact with a person or object. A series of small droplets may be treated differently from a smear or a larger pooled stain. But blood stains do not arrive with labels, and they do not identify the exact moment, weapon, movement, or action that created them. That uncertainty would become central to Michael Peterson's trial. The blood on the staircase became a disputed message. Prosecutors pointed to its amount, distribution, and location as signs of a violent struggle, arguing that Kathleen Peterson had been struck repeatedly rather than simply losing her balance. The defense offered a different mechanism. A fall onto hard, narrow steps could produce extensive bleeding, especially from a head wound, and could leave blood on nearby walls and flooring. Every mark seemed to demand an explanation, yet none could speak for itself. The stains showed where blood had landed, and some appeared as drops, smears, or projected patterns, but they could not plainly reveal who had moved, who had struck, or whether anyone had intended harm. They were traces of an event, not a complete recording of the minutes before Kathleen was found. The trial's first major turn was unsettling because it did not rest on a simple object such as a weapon or on a confession. It rested heavily on interpretation, on what experts believed the blood patterns meant. In a courtroom, that distinction mattered. The same staircase could be described as the site of a beating or as the dangerous path of an accidental fall, depending on which stains an expert emphasized. Everyone agreed that blood was present. The harder question was what had happened before it reached the walls, the steps, and the floor. The case was beginning to depend less on what the scene contained than on the story built from it. Each droplet became part of a sequence involving position, movement, injury, and timing, even though the physical evidence could not independently confirm every link in that sequence. Prosecutors did not rely on blood alone. They built a wider case around financial pressure, Michael Peterson's private life, and an earlier unexplained death connected to his family history. The state sought to place Kathleen's death within circumstances that could suggest motive, while the defense challenged whether those circumstances proved anything about the staircase on the night of December 9, 2001. The bloodstain patterns were meant to give that larger story physical force. If the stains suggested an attack, then questions about money and marriage could appear to point toward a reason for it. Without that interpretation, financial conflict and personal secrets remained background facts. With it, prosecutors could argue that the physical scene supported an intentional act rather than an accident. The courtroom moved into private territory. Michael Peterson's bisexuality was presented as part of the prosecution's effort to shape the jury's view of his marriage and his character. Evidence about relationships with men was not itself proof that Kathleen had been killed, but it was introduced to challenge the image of the couple's domestic life and to suggest concealed tensions inside the Durham home. That choice carried a human cost. Kathleen's death risked becoming more than an investigation into how she died. It became a public judgment of the life she and Michael had shared, including parts of that life that had once belonged only to them. Private correspondence and intimate details were examined before jurors, transforming a family tragedy into evidence about secrecy, trust, and perceived betrayal. Financial pressure was offered as a possible answer to the question of why Michael might kill Kathleen. If prosecutors could show serious money problems, they could give the jury a motive that fit their theory of an intentional attack. Household finances, debts, employment concerns, and the couple's standard of living therefore became relevant to the state's narrative, even though none of those facts could identify the person who caused Kathleen's injuries. And if that motive seemed believable, the blood evidence could appear to carry more meaning. A stain was no longer only a stain. It became part of a chain, linking pressure, opportunity, and alleged violence. The prosecution's theory depended on those elements reinforcing one another. A troubled marriage supplied context, financial strain supplied motive, and the staircase supplied the physical evidence of an attack. Then the prosecution brought forward another disturbing piece of history. Elizabeth Ratliff, a family friend who had lived in Germany, had died in 1985 after being found at the bottom of a staircase. Michael Peterson had known Ratliff and later became guardian to her daughters. Her death had been treated as an accident at the time, but the old case acquired new significance after Kathleen's fatal fall. That death did not directly explain what happened to Kathleen in Durham. It occurred 16 years earlier and on another continent, involving a different woman and a separate investigation. But it invited the jury to see a pattern around Michael Peterson, connecting two women, two staircases, and two deaths separated by years and distance. The comparison was powerful precisely because the underlying circumstances were not identical. This is where character evidence can change the way people see physical facts. Once jurors hear troubling information about a person, they may begin to read every neutral detail as suspicious. A delay in calling for help, an unusual statement, or the location of a bloodstain can seem more incriminating when placed beside allegations about secrecy, money, and an earlier death. Money worries, private relationships, and an earlier unexplained death could make the staircase appear different in the jury's mind. The blood still had to be interpreted, but now it was being viewed through a story about Michael Peterson rather than in isolation. The central question remained whether Kathleen had fallen or been attacked. Yet every answer was now being filtered through motive, character, and the unsettling history placed before the court. The defense offered a different reading of the staircase. Michael Peterson's account required the jury to accept that Kathleen died in a fall, not from an attack, and that the blood came from injuries sustained as her body struck the steps, the walls, and the floor. Under that theory, the scene was tragic and chaotic, but not necessarily evidence of a beating. That explanation did not erase the stains. It changed what they were being asked to mean. The same marks could be treated as signs of a violent assault, or as the result of a terrible fall followed by bleeding in a narrow, hard-sided space. Their location, shape, and distribution mattered, but only after the experts decided what sequence could have produced them. The jury faced a burden that had no simple answer. They had to weigh the bloodstain patterns, the history of Michael and Kathleen's marriage, claims about money, and competing explanations from specialists, while Kathleen could no longer correct any version of what happened. The case was tried in Durham County, North Carolina, but the disputed events inside that staircase remained impossible to reconstruct with certainty. That silence gave the evidence unusual power. Every detail had to speak for a woman who was not there to describe her final moments, and the more the lawyers argued over the scene, the farther the truth seemed to move from ordinary human understanding. A stain on a step could be discussed for minutes, while Kathleen's own account of what happened could never be heard. Expert testimony could turn uncertainty into something that sounded firm. A specialist could discuss the size, shape, and position of blood marks, use careful measurements, and connect separate stains into a proposed sequence of events. The testimony might distinguish a transfer mark from a projected drop or a larger pool from smaller spatter, then use those classifications to support an explanation of how Kathleen's body had moved. For jurors, technical language can make physical evidence feel almost final. Yet blood does not explain itself. It records contact, injury, and movement, but it does not identify every action that came before the mark appeared. Even precise observations could not independently establish who caused the injuries, whether an object had been used, or how much time passed between one event and the next. The central question remained interpretation. The stains could be examined again and again, but their meaning depended on the assumptions used to place them into a story. If the starting assumption was an assault, the marks could appear consistent with blows and movement. If the starting assumption was a fall, the same evidence could be fitted into a different chain of contact, bleeding, and collapse, and one moment could not be recovered. What happened between Kathleen being alive and Kathleen being found at the bottom of the stairs remained outside the reach of every test, photograph, and expert opinion. No laboratory could recreate the exact position of her body, the force of each impact, or the decisions made by anyone present during those missing minutes. The blood could be measured, but the exact order of movement, injury, and delay could not be replayed. That missing sequence became the quiet center of the trial, hidden beneath layers of argument. A pattern might show where blood traveled, yet it could not by itself provide a complete timeline, identify intent, or settle whether the fatal injuries came from a fall or an assault. The prosecution asked the jury to see more than a staircase. The bloodstains, the family's financial strain, Michael's sexuality, and the earlier death of family friend Elizabeth Ratliff in Germany were presented as parts of one larger story about him. Ratliff had died in 1985, years before Kathleen's death, but prosecutors argued that the circumstances made her history relevant to the case. The force of that case came from the combination. Any one detail might have seemed unclear on its own, but together they were meant to create a pattern in which the staircase became the final piece. Financial pressures supplied a possible motive, personal history supplied context, and the blood evidence supplied the physical setting where prosecutors said the story ended in homicide. In 2003, Michael Peterson was convicted of murdering Kathleen. The verdict showed that the prosecution's full interpretation had persuaded the jury beyond a reasonable doubt. It also demonstrated how circumstantial evidence can operate as a connected structure, with separate facts gaining greater force when jurors view them as parts of the same explanation. It did not mean every question about the staircase had disappeared. It meant the jury accepted that the blood, the surrounding evidence, and the proposed motive pointed to homicide rather than an accidental fall. The legal standard had been met in the courtroom, even though the physical evidence could not provide a complete, independently verified account of every movement before Kathleen was found. A conviction brought a legal answer, but it did not repair what had been broken. Kathleen's death had already divided a family through grief, and the verdict added a lasting divide between those who believed Michael killed her and those who feared an innocent man had been condemned. The staircase remained the center of that conflict because its bloodstains could be measured by everyone, yet interpreted in sharply different ways. The case changed when Duane Deaver, the prosecution's bloodstain analyst, came under serious attack. His work for the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation was reviewed after questions arose about his methods, his reports, and the strength of the claims he had made in court. The review damaged Deaver's credibility. He had helped present the blood evidence as support for a murder theory, but later findings showed that his testimony had overstated what the stains could prove. The original conviction had not rested on one fact alone, yet his testimony had helped connect many separate facts into a single prosecution story. That collapse exposed a painful weakness in the verdict. A courtroom can reach a firm decision using evidence that later proves unstable, because jurors must judge the case with the information placed before them at that time. The bloodstains on the staircase did not change. They remained where they had been found years earlier. What changed was the meaning built around them after the witness who gave those stains much of their authority was discredited. The case also raised a wider fear about expert evidence. People often trust a professional answer because it sounds exact, measured, and calm. In a frightening case, that certainty can feel like solid ground. But expertise is not the same as proof. If an expert relies on weak methods, leaves out limits, or speaks with more confidence than the evidence allows, precision can become dangerous. It can make an uncertain explanation appear settled before the missing facts have been found. The damage reached beyond Deaver's testimony. Michael Peterson's murder conviction was later overturned after the problems with the witness came to light. The ruling did not establish exactly how Kathleen died, and it did not prove that every part of the prosecution's case was false. It showed something narrower, but still powerful. The first trial had been weakened so badly that its verdict could no longer stand with confidence. The legal system had to confront the possibility that a jury had been led toward certainty by evidence that should have been treated with greater caution. After the conviction was overturned, the years seemed to hold two incompatible truths. Kathleen was still gone, and the staircase still carried the marks of her final injuries. Michael was no longer held by the original murder verdict, but he could not simply return to the life that existed before the trial. For Kathleen's family, the reversal did not close the wound. It reopened the arguments surrounding her death and forced old memories back into the center of public attention. The courtroom had delivered a verdict, then taken away its foundation, leaving grief without a final explanation. In 2017, Michael Peterson entered an Alford plea. In plain terms, this allowed him to maintain his claim of innocence while accepting that prosecutors had enough evidence to pursue a conviction. It was not a simple confession. It was also not a declaration that the staircase had been fully explained. The plea brought a legal end to the case through a negotiated outcome, with Peterson receiving a sentence that amounted to time already served, but it left the central dispute intact. Kathleen died at the bottom of the staircase. Michael said she fell. Prosecutors had said she was killed. The murder conviction was overturned, and the Alford plea ended the prosecution without answering which account was true. That is what makes the case endure. The blood evidence remained real, but its meaning was contested. A witness lost credibility, a verdict collapsed, and a legal resolution arrived without restoring the missing moment between Kathleen's last known minutes alive and the discovery of her body. The blood on the staircase established a violent medical emergency. Kathleen suffered fatal injuries in or near that stairwell, and the walls, steps, and floor recorded the movement of blood after those injuries occurred. But the stains did not identify the person responsible, explain the cause of the injuries, or reveal what happened in the missing minutes before death. The prosecution asked the jury to build a larger story from that physical record. Certain marks were presented as signs of repeated blows. The amount and placement of blood were linked to an attack, while the absence of a clear weapon was treated as another piece of the same theory. The defense argued that these conclusions went beyond what the stains could prove, turning patterns into assumptions about intent, movement, and guilt. That was the case's most chilling reversal. A scene that first appeared to offer certainty became an example of how certainty can rest on unstable testimony. Blood evidence was not worthless, it was real evidence. The danger came when its meaning was treated as fixed, even though trained experts could disagree about how the stains were formed. A bloodstain pattern can help show that bleeding occurred, and it may help place bloodshed within a particular area. It can sometimes suggest movement or force, but it cannot, by itself, name a killer, settle motive, or recover every action inside a private home. In Peterson's trial, those limits were pushed against the pressure of a story that needed the evidence to speak with one voice. And beneath the expert reports, Kathleen began to disappear. She was discussed as a fall victim, a homicide victim, or a central point in someone else's theory. Her work, her relationships, and the people who knew her were filtered through legal labels. The woman at the center of the case could not correct the record, challenge an interpretation, or explain the final moments of her own life. That silence carried a weight of its own. Every argument about angles and impact took place because Kathleen was no longer there to describe what happened. The trial preserved fragments of her life, but it could not preserve her voice. In the end, the case asked strangers to reconstruct a death from marks left behind by a moment no witness could fully recover. The jury faced an information problem that no bloodstain chart could solve. They had to compare the physical scene with Michael Peterson's account, the experts' competing interpretations, questions about financial pressure, intimate evidence about his character, and the unexplained death of Elizabeth Ratliff in Germany. Each detail affected the others, making it difficult to view any single piece in isolation. The blood did not arrive in court alone. It arrived beside a marriage, a household, past secrets, and a prosecution theory about what might have driven a person to kill. For jurors, the challenge was not simply deciding what a stain meant. It was deciding how much confidence to place in a chain of meaning built from evidence, memory, and interpretation. That problem reaches far beyond one courtroom. Modern audiences often expect science to deliver one final answer, especially when evidence is measured, photographed, and explained by an expert. But a scientific method does not remove uncertainty when the facts are incomplete. A measurement can be accurate while the conclusion drawn from it remains open to dispute. The Peterson case exposed that gap between evidence and certainty. The stains were part of the record, but the story attached to them changed as testimony was challenged. What looked precise could still depend on judgment. What sounded technical could still influence emotion. And what appeared to be neutral evidence could become one of the strongest voices in a case built around competing narratives. The legal lesson emerged through the case's sequence. Blood and surrounding evidence helped produce Michael Peterson's 2003 murder conviction. Years later, the prosecution's bloodstain witness was discredited after serious problems were found in his testimony and methods. The conviction was overturned, not because the court solved Kathleen's death, but because the original trial had been damaged badly enough that its result could not stand. In 2017, Peterson entered an Alford plea accepting a legal outcome while maintaining his innocence. That sequence changed how many courts, lawyers, and investigators viewed expert testimony. It strengthened the demand that specialists explain not only what evidence may show, but also where its limits begin. The long-term result was not a new answer about the staircase. It was a harder question asked of every confident scientific claim. Is the conclusion supported by the evidence, or only made persuasive by the way it is presented? The case also left a lasting mark on public memory. For many people, the staircase became a symbol of disputed forensic certainty, repeated through documentaries, legal analysis, and years of debate. Kathleen's death entered a wider culture of true crime in which real suffering can be turned into a puzzle, while the person who died risks becoming secondary to the theories surrounding her. For the families connected to the case, there was no clean ending. A conviction brought one kind of finality, its reversal removed that certainty, and the Alford plea closed the legal process without settling the central question. The people left behind had to live with an outcome that was official, but not complete. In that unresolved space, bloodstains remained evidence, never an answer. For the Peterson family, the case did not end with Michael Peterson's 2003 conviction or his 2017 Alford plea. Kathleen Peterson's death remained tied to years of hearings, appeals, public suspicion, and divided loyalties. Even after the legal process ended without a conventional admission of guilt, the family's private loss remained connected to an argument over blood. The wider shock came from Durham, North Carolina, where the record showed how expert evidence could shape a verdict before its limits were fully understood. In 2011, Judge Orlando Hudson ordered a new trial after finding serious problems with testimony from Duane Deaver, an analyst with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, whose bloodstain conclusions had supported the prosecution. That finding changed more than Michael Peterson's legal position. It demonstrated how a bloodstain opinion could sound exact in court while depending on judgment, training, laboratory practice, and information that might be wrong or incomplete. Measurements and patterns could be presented as objective, even when the interpretation behind them remained vulnerable. Yet one question remained outside the reach of every ruling. Did Kathleen Peterson fall by accident, die by another person's hand, or suffer some event that the surviving evidence could never clearly reconstruct? The courts could evaluate testimony and procedure, but they could not recover the missing seconds before she was discovered. The record can describe the staircase, the blood, the testimony, and the failures in the investigation. It can identify when Kathleen was found, document the injuries recorded by medical examiners, and trace how investigators interpreted the stains. It cannot fully settle what happened in the final moments before her death. The case left a lasting lesson in criminal courts. Physical evidence may be real, carefully collected, and powerfully presented, while the meaning assigned to it remains open to challenge. A stain can establish that blood was present, but interpretation must still account for timing, movement, surfaces, injury, and the possibility of error. In 2011, Deaver's credibility collapsed under scrutiny, and the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation later dismissed him. That institutional consequence became part of the case's enduring legacy. Expert authority must be tested through reliable methods, complete disclosure, and independent review, rather than accepted simply because it carries an official title. And at the bottom of the staircase, the bloodstains remained silent, preserving the question that the trial never truly answered. They became central evidence in a prosecution, a reason for appellate challenge, and a warning about certainty in court. Their presence was never the same as proof of exactly how Kathleen Peterson died.